So it's great to be back. When something like this happens at the monastery, one of the first things that touched me is that people in beautiful, elegant black robes, or possibly samawe, pop up, and things happen. And though it takes some time, a moment of this or that, there's always kind of a seamless coordination, some kind of invisible communication going on that I'm not a priest, so I don't know what they're doing, but it so far always works. And I came to appreciate the meaning of that, of moving as one body to benefit other beings. That's quite an accomplishment. So on this retreat, for the benefit of the people who weren't here, we were talking in one way or another over time about fear. And I chose that topic because since the beginning of the pandemic, as the social service systems have fallen apart and healthcare has been stressed and churches are just overloaded with pastoral care, I began to talk to more and more people who weren't even Buddhist. Oh, I found you online, and I just was wondering if we could chat. And not about Buddhism. I really don't want to be a Buddhist, but there isn't anybody else. And mostly what those people talked about, in one way or another, could be called fear. And so it seemed timely, maybe. What I learned from those many teachers, strangers that I met once or twice or 3 times, was how many different ways fear could arise. It's so a myriad, like a kaleidoscope. This thing which I have called fear all my life isn't a thing. It's it's a cloud. Certain things come together, and then there's this. And then the weather changes, and the sky changes, and then it looks like this. Fear is like that. And I saw so many forms, and I was grateful for learning about fear, because of course I also have fear, right? And so I always think the more you know, the better. And we pick any period in history, and right in the last 2 years, we've been so focused on the fears of this time of COVID, because this is our time. But I remember before I left the monastery when COVID began, Chosen Roshi gave a talk about all the different periods in history, all the different places where pandemics had happened, and how some places they went on for centuries. It was just so broadening, expanding. As soon as it was COVID and we were all in trouble and my kids were out there and I was in here, I constricted down into kind of a small, like hunker down and wait it out kind of attitude. But her talk reminded me, no, this happens. We just had a roll there for a while where it didn't. So if we look back at history, people can tell you what caused their fear, at least their ideas about that. And they can tell you, and they like to tell you, I think, how much energy they spent on fear and how much of their life was dealing with anxiety and how much of what they had was drained away looking for a kind of certainty that if it ever came at all, only came as what they later discovered to be a kind of illusion of certainty. And so I listen to the radio sometimes because I live alone, I listen to NPR. I pretend like those fine people are in the room next to me. And one of the things they talk about fairly often is all of the consequences of fear. And I find that heart-opening. It distracts us from work. It distracts us from leisure. Oh, I feel tender around that one. It constricts life. Like life was so big. I used to sit around and think, oh, I'll go to Nepal this year. This will be the year. Haven't been in a few years. I'll go back. And then, boom, pandemic. And then, okay, Delta's over. I'll go back. Boop, boom, Omicron. And so it has a way of narrowing, I think, maybe not really our possibilities, but our sense of possibility. And sometimes I see, as I watch, so I live in Selwood right now, which is kind of a little village, and I like to walk down the main avenue of the village, and I see the way that fear constricts people's activities on kind of a micro level, and not just fear of COVID, but in the beginning even of COVID, people would walk down the street and we would cross the street, right? Because we felt unsafe, or maybe not unsafe for ourselves, but even in fear of harming someone else. So an old person or a family with children, I would always cross the street. Another old person, I would always cross the street. And then as I became sensitized to fear, I also learned about fears that had nothing to do with COVID, or at least seemed like they didn't. Like the simple fear of not being able to be who you feel yourself wants to be. Not being able to live that life, or not being able to live it openly. I have 2 BIPOC, non-binary children. And when I came out of retreat, they were old enough to dialogue with me about those experiences. So in one way of looking, we can say, well, like COVID, like all social issues that arise, abide, and stabilize, and arise, abide again, and stabilize as the years go by, we could say fear comes and goes, right? It's passing phenomena. Little fears, I was so afraid they'd make me wear a mask. I was so afraid they wouldn't wear a mask. Those kinds of fears. But you who practice also see something else, I think, which is quite precious, which is that in the human realm, fear is ubiquitous. It's never not there in our ordinary hustle and bustle day. So you can be having what I call a good roll, a roll of good fortune. And it can be privilege or just joy or opportunity or health or whatever it is. And then underneath that, if you sit still, if you look, there can be a little drip feed of the experience of uneasiness. So I don't know exactly fear is the right word, but some kind of an instability or imbalance. What is that? What is that? Even people who don't practice talk about that, a kind of slight nervousness. I was remembering when I was typing this up, I used to teach 4th grade, and there was a little boy in my class in 4th grade, so he's about 9 years old, and his brother had kidney failure, and so he had to go in for dialysis, a little 3rd grader who was about this tall, because of his kidney failure, I guess, little tiny guy. And so his little brother got all of the supportive energy and love in the family. And so that little guy used to get on his bike early in the morning, and he would bike over to my classroom, and I had a big 20-pound bag of granola that the district gave me, and he would come in and scoop out his granola and park his bike in the back of the class and come and sit by my desk. So I didn't have so much to offer in those days. I was just barely over 20. And every morning I would just say to him, so how you doing today? Some mornings, I wasn't doing so good. That's how it is when you're 20. And one day he said, I'm okay. And I said, you don't seem so okay today. And he said, well, I have and he was feeling around here. And he said, I have a nervous person in here. This little guy smoked, I should mention, because he had a nervous person in here. And I said, oh, 21, you don't know what to say to that. 9-year-old's not supposed to have a nervous person in there. But I looked at him and I loved him so much, and I saw, oh, in the moment of seeing his nervousness, I also had a nervous person in here. And so I just said, Gary, I have a nervous person too. And he was just quiet. He had a lovely spaciousness about him. And he said, you have a nervous person too? And I said, yeah. And he said, he put his little hand here on me and one hand on him. And he said, do you think they should talk to each other? Yeah, so we did. We talked. Then as I got older, and taught college and became a consultant and talked to lots of people every year, I discovered that many people have a nervous person inside, takes up residence, and maybe, never goes away. And that's fear. So in the Vajrayana, we say this about fear. Fear is a feeling. And if you struggle against any feeling as it arises, it will increase. The more you try to push it down, you push it down here, it comes up over here. So oppression is not ever the solution. The more you try to make yourself comfortable by diverting, by ignoring, by not giving a feeling what it's asking for, the more uncomfortable you become. So many people spend their lifetime in a fear relationship kind of hazy. They know they're afraid, and they're just diverting. Maybe if I buy more, do more, be more, eat more, shop more, better job, more sex, whatever it is, that fear will go away. Sometimes works for a little bit, right? But the fear comes back. So how do you work with fear if you want to feel more freedom from fear? I think you know this, but I think it's great to take it out and dust it off over and over. One is that you have to really be willing to meet yourself in a really honest way. No aggression. Judgment won't help. No worry, that doesn't help. Nothing wrong with it, but it doesn't help. No hiding out, though. You have to sit down and you have to muster a willing heart to have unconditional friendliness with yourself. I took a class with John Kabat-Zinn, and he called the wholeness of us our full catastrophe. I think that came from the play or the book Zorba the Greek. And I thought, yeah, that's what it is. Because we all have a place where we are whole and powerful and wonderful and organized or whatever we think we should be. And then we have all of these other awkward, embarrassing places, secrets that we hope nobody finds out. And if you want to be fearless, you have to invite all of that in. It's like a little private party where you say, everyone is invited. Yes, I mean everybody. And it's kind of a raw process. So I don't know how it is for you. I'm talking about my experience. It was kind of excruciating to put the lens of awareness and to see it, to use the ability, the tiny little ability that I developed in shamatha to see something clearly and to sit with it for a little bit, to use that turned inward, to acknowledge the complexity and the ordinary being that I was. it required for me a lot of giving up a kind of pretend safety that I'd built for myself. Very quickly, that safety was like a little card house that just went poof. And then there I was, and then sitting, especially in four immeasurables practice. I don't know why, but I could feel layers of varnish or wallpaper or something that I'd put over myself to look a little better than I was. And they would peel off and fall away and be steamed off and fall away. And I felt more and more naked and more cracks were there. And you have to kind of trust that process. I don't think I could have done it without Dharma friends and a good teacher. But when we do this in meditation, one of the beautiful things about meditation is that it's spacious and it's quiet. And so all of that chaos has a container that for me felt safe and good, even when it was risky. And eventually it kind of started to feel like a treasure hunt. I wonder what's going to come up today. Some crazy piece of myself that I didn't even know existed. So what do? You just notice it and really stay. In fact, I think all of the instruction in those years could have been reduced, in my case, to stay put. To stay put, or sit, stay. Same thing I use with my dog, sit, stay, sit, stay, sit, stay. And one of the things I learned was you better not try to fix your fear. It's not a broken thing. It's not something to be corrected. That doesn't work. If you try to judge it or fix it, it hides, and you can't do the work that you need to do. So you just get curious. My teacher said, be curious. Maybe your fear, maybe your negativity, maybe your habitual tendencies are not like other people's. They're all your own, so you have to get to know them. When do they happen? When do they not happen? What sets them off? Where do I feel it in the body? Is it a pattern or a one-off thing? On, and it's not a thinking process, and it took forever to get out of that habit. I would start looking at it, and my first diverting strategy was to stop looking and start thinking about it. Well, it probably comes from here, and it seems to arise in 4 parts, and each part has a similar nature except for the 4th. Wow, that was an exit strategy. Took me a year to figure that out, I'm sure. Recently, my eldest progeny went off on a trip for 8 months and left his cat with me. I don't know anything about cats. So I had to get curious about that cat. And in the beginning, I was a little afraid of the cat. And so I would sit in my office and think about the cat who was in the dining room. And I would think, I'm getting to know the cat. And I would go online and I would read about cats because I was in my office and my computer. And I was thinking, I'm starting to know quite a bit about cats. But I wasn't starting to know about that cat, because that cat was in the other room. I was in my office, she was in the dining room. If you want to know a cat, I discovered you have to get close. You have to let it in your lap. You have to let it on your table, like we saw in Sin's room this morning on Zoom. And then you ask yourself, does it have a smell? Does it have a color? Does it have a shape? Is the shape always the same? Is it changing? Where does the cat go when the cat leaves? Where did this cat come from? That one I think I knew, but really where did it come from was a complicated thing, right? That's why I couldn't just give the cat back, because it came from some kind of trust and connection. Getting to know cat nature. So just like that, we get to know our anger and other things that we're working on. We have to be a scientist of sorts running an experiment, and we need real data, and the only real data with feelings, and feelings like fear, which are so complex and so simple, is to look at them directly. You know, we could read a study, but that never ever helped me get rid of something. And so when we look at a feeling like fear, we see it's really potent. It's also completely vaporous. Nothing, right? One of my fears growing up, I think, my mother, when I was born, my mom was 16, my dad was 21. And they were very poor. And they came from families that did not model good parenting or good too much else except maybe good sense of humor. And so they put a lot of pressure to be good and to do well. And they would say, my nickname was Spud when I was little. I guess I was around then too. And they would say, you know, Spud, you can be anything you want to be. You're so smart, so bright, so good. You can be anything, anything. And they would talk like that. And so I grew up thinking I could, but also feeling the pressure of that, which I'm sure that some of you feel too, as its own kind of fear. So what you begin to learn when you look at a fear like that, you begin to learn what's it like. It's potent, it's vaporous, it comes and goes, and there's a piece of it, a thread of it, which seems to remain. What is that? And sooner or later it began or begins to feel more like weather. When things are this way, that fear arrives. And when those things change, that fear seems to vaporize. And less like a prison. So I found that to be a super helpful method, just direct, just invitational, just inclusive. We talk about inclusivity so much right now. It has to start, right here, home base. But I would give one piece of advice about that method, which is start small. Don't start with your biggest fear. Start with a tiny fear, like maybe you put on some red shoes and then you realize you have on a green outfit. I don't own anything red or green, but, making this up. And then you think, ooh, what will people think of me? And right there, that's it. That's the thing, just rest into that. It feels like nothing, so that's wonderful. But it's definitely something. And much of what you discover, I think, when you do that is a lot of the things I was afraid of were just ideas, just stories that somebody planted in my head. And so when I hear those stories, they still come up after all these years. I just say to myself, that's not me, and that's not mine. I am not that. And then I rest for a minute into what I am. So I would say if you have big fear, start with just, I call it titration, take a drop, little fear like that. And when you feel pretty good, like, okay, I didn't die, then next time 2 drops, then 4 drops, then buckets, and eventually you can pick up the hose and take on a bigger fear. And maybe one day you'll know that something scary is going to happen for you and you can kind of plan for it. All right, I'm ready. And when we go and you're met with that big fear, maybe it's shocking in the moment, but then you feel like this is just that, only on steroids. And so you let it in and you feel, but because you were ready, you didn't get blindsided by it. It landed different, maybe we could say. And little by little, I think something happens when we work in this friendly and direct way. There begins to be a feeling of shift. A kind of freshness or lightness or a sense of spaciousness. And for me, that always comes with a little bit of sense of humor. Like, oh, it's actually kind of funny how I am, how we are. So I encourage you to work with fear, the fear of being alone, the fear of being disconnected, the fear of not being worthy, whatever your fears are. And one of the most beautiful things about looking at fear in yourself in this microscopic way is that it allows you to understand the fears of others. And I can remember when I used to be sometimes maybe angry with my teacher. He'd hit a soft spot, And I'd be a little angry feeling, and he could tell because I make a little face when I'm mad. And he would say, oh, you're suffering. Sorry. And I would always think he would say, why are you angry? How could you have been practicing for 2 years and you're still angry? Never said that. He would say, oh, you're hurting. You're hurting. So we recognize that because we've done our own work. And we know when I send up this firework, I'm hurting. And we begin to see that in others. And at that moment, we become a refuge for those people. You can come to me when you're hurting, and I will not make you pay a price for being how you are. You're safe. This is your safe space. I will be your safe space so that you can do your work. So what is fearlessness? Fearlessness is just, it's not no fear. It's getting comfortable with the fact that fear is just a fact of life. It's just, when a fear firework goes off, it's old karma. It's coming up. We can't control that. It will always come up. The fear of not being worthy, it will always come up. The inner critic, it will always come up. But when it comes up, you will not be fooled. At some point, you will say, the inner critic comes up, you are not worthy. Oh, small one, you are not worthy. And you will think to yourself, thank you, I know you're trying to take care of me now. Go back in the box. Don't need you right now. So the experience changes little by little. Someone asked me the other day, what are the most important tools for the journey? I had to think about that. I thought, wow, what are they? Friends, that's helpful on the path. But I think just the willingness to continue, kind of determination, is maybe super helpful. And then I remembered, when I was thinking about determination, this little poem, which I would like to read to you, and we'll finish with this. I had this with me on 3-year retreat. It was in a book that someone gave me. Just fell out of the book one day. It's by a Japanese poet who I had never heard of, named Kenji Miyazawa. And this particular translation is by an Australian man named Roger Pulvers. And the name of the poem is Strong in the Rain. And I read this every single day. I kept it taped on the wall of my box because it was such a beautiful map for how I wanted to work with determination, and yet it was so gentle. Strong in the rain, strong in the wind, strong against the summer heat and snow. She is healthy and robust, free from desire. She never loses her temper nor the quiet smile on her lips. She eats 4 go of unpolished rice, miso, and a few vegetables a day. She does not consider herself in whatever occurs. Her understanding comes from observation and experience, and she never loses sight of things. She lives in a little thatched roof hut in a field in the shadows of a pine tree grove. If there is a sick child in the east, she goes there to nurse the child. If there's a tired mother in the west, she goes to her and carries her sheaves. If someone is near death in the south, she goes and says, "Don't be afraid." If there are strife and lawsuits in the north, she demands that the people put an end to their pettiness. She weeps at the time of drought and plods about at a loss during the cold summer. Everyone calls her blockhead. No one sings her praises or takes her to heart. That's the kind of person I want to be. So thank you to Kenji Miyazawa for that. I wish you determination. I wish you friends on the path. I wish you gentle, loving friendship with your fear and your pleasure and every experience. Thank you.